poetry is something quite significant within Japanese history and culture. The delicate crafting of words into feelings, expressions, and ideas, done to mark occasions, reflections, and even at the end of a life. Many samurai were also avid poets, some even becoming very well renowned in the art. One such name we have examined the poetry of before, being that of Akechi Mitsuhide. And although there is much we could dive into regarding Japanese poetry, which could take up several different videos, the topic that we are exploring here today in particular is a type of poetry that is perhaps not as well known. Throughout the Sengoku and Edo periods, the Shinobi, often known by their modern alias ninja, have been portrayed as masters of stealth and strategy. Their name, Shinobi, comes from the verb shinobu, meaning to conceal oneself or hide. But beneath their storied skills of espionage and warfare exists a part of the Shinobi rarely discussed, one full of poetry and song. Now, I have touched on the Shinobi before in several videos. There is a whole playlist on this subject for you to check out. Yet, this video is going to be a bit different. In the past, I've worked with such fellow channels and creators as Tairyu Shakuhachi, Anthony Cummins, and Sengoku Studies. And recently, I was asked if I wanted to be part of a larger collaboration involving all of them, and also Tales of Dawn and Dusk, on the topic of Shinobi poetry, to which I happily agreed. Now, I have to admit, this is a topic I am not as familiar with, although the topic of poetry is one which has intrigued me over the years, specifically that of haiku and death poems. Shinobi poetry is a mysterious topic I have not tread into before. So, before getting into it, you should know that it was they who were truly behind the research and writing to craft this video on such a topic. This video, being on my channel, serves as merely a platform for them to come together for this collaboration. I highly implore you to go check out all of their great channels, which will be linked down below. So, with that said, let's explore the hidden meanings of the secret verses of the Shinobi, and uncover how these enigmatic warriors used poetry and song to communicate, disguise their intent, and even to unlock deeper aspects of their craft. We'll examine the hidden meanings behind their words, how these poems were sung, and what they reveal about the life and times of the Shinobi. So, sit back and grab a cup of tea, but be sure to check the golden lid, just in case it is poisoned. And let's dive in.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for having us. My name is Anthony Cummins, and you're here to learn about ninja poems, or Shinobi Uta. First of all, let's have a look at an example of a ninja poem.
Shinobi tsutsu mitsuru koto wo ezu ni shite, kunsha ni mukai dongo wo seo. Always draw what you have learned while scouting, and then report it to the strategist directly in person.
The next question we have to ask is, what are Japanese poems? What do we know about Japanese poetry? So let's investigate Japanese poems.
Poetry in general has a long history in Japan, dating back to even before the Japanese language had its own writing system. Across the world today, the most famous form of Japanese poetry is probably haiku. However, throughout much of Japanese history, the most popular form of poetry was tanka. Tanka is usually translated as short poem, but the ka in the name actually uses the character for song, singing, something like that. It is a form of waka, usually translated as Japanese poem or poetry, or poems, poetry in Japanese. The wa refers to Japan. However, as within tanka, the ka means something about song or singing, and so it actually means something closer to Japanese song or songs. This term developed to differentiate them from kanshi, meaning Han poems or poetry. Therefore, Chinese-style poems written in Chinese. The structure of a tanka is 5 lines, for the lack of a better word, and each of those lines have a defined number of moras. A mora is the shortest sound in a language, and it can be a syllable, or it can be shorter than a syllable. As a quick example, the capital of Japan, Tokyo, is 2 syllables, to and kyo, but because of the long o sounds, it is actually 4 moras, to, o, kyo, o. The tanka adds up to 31 moras with a pattern of 5-7, 577. Tanka were composed for various reasons, such as, but not limited to, love letters, general correspondence, as part of diaries, part of prose, and even military poems.
伊勢武者はひどしの鎧着て宇治の網代にかかりけるかな.
Another form of poetry based on the tanka is renga, and this poetry form dates back to the Heian period, but it gained its greatest popularity among the warrior class of medieval Japan. It is usually translated as linked verse, and the term comes from renga being two or more linked related tanka that make up a single poem. While there are some examples of renga being composed by one person, they were usually collaborative works, with one person starting with the first 3 lines of a tanka, and then someone else completes the last 2 lines. Then somebody writes the first 3 lines of a new but related tanka, somebody writes the last 2 lines, and so on and so on. Everyone knows haiku. This is a short form of Japanese poetry. It became popular during the Edo period. Haiku emphasizes brevity, clarity, and a zen-like mindfulness on the present moment. The art lies in saying much in very little. A haiku is made of 3 lines with a Mora scheme of 5-7-5. To say that Japanese poetry is a massive topic would be an understatement, but having a general idea of what these poems are will be useful moving forward.
So far, we have an example of a ninja poem, and we've looked at Japanese poetry. So let's go a bit deeper into what is ninja poetry, or Shinobi Uta.
Hey everybody, Tales of Dawn and Dusk here to explain a little bit more about the poetry of these shinobi poems. As mentioned before, the shinobi preferred the tanka style of poetry, as all of the ninja poems were written in the tanka genre. However, the most interesting thing about this collection of poems is how different they are from typical tanka poetry we find in Japanese history. When looking at the most famous tanka poems from collections like the Kokin Wakashu, the artistry is immediately apparent and becomes more impressive the more you understand classical Japanese. In the case of the shinobi poems, however, there is a distinct intent of transferring information rather than creating a work of linguistic art. There are no familiar motifs like tear-soaked sleeves, the autumn moon, salt fires on the seashore, nor puns or wordplays like shinobu, which can simultaneously mean to sneak and to think fondly of or to yearn for. No famous place names or other references like the mountains of Yoshino, the Kamo River, or the barrier at Osaka. Nor are there familiar poetic stock phrases called makura kotoba. Examples of these include hisakata no, which precedes visuals of things in the sky, or perhaps the most applicable to the ninja poems, nubatama no, which describes the deep black of night. One could easily imagine the composer using a line like tsuki o mireba, or glancing at the moon, to open one of the poems about ninja activity during the full moon, or to explain how to sneak past the guards at the aforementioned Osaka barrier, which is a very common motif which symbolizes a lover secretly rendezvousing with his mistress. To do this would have added some artistic weight to the poems, but these kinds of references are completely absent. Let's look at one of these shinobi tanka and break it down grammatically. Jingae no yoi no araba, shinobi ni wa sakidachite yuku annai o mio. If you are moving your forces, send a shinobi ahead to learn the lay of the land. Now, one thing to mention. The utilization of Chinese loanwords in tanka poetry isn't strictly forbidden per se, but it's normally not used unless phrasing dictates it's absolutely necessary. Shinobi poems, however, make liberal use of Chinese loanwords to meet syllable counts while still communicating their ideas. This example, poem number 8, is perfect to demonstrate this because it has not just one, not just two, but 3 Chinese loanwords in it: jin, yoi, and annai. The first word in the poem is a compound of the Chinese loanword jin, which means army, battle formation, or in this case, camp/positions, and the native Japanese word gae, which comes from the verb kaeru, which means to change. So literally, jingae means the changing of camps or positions. This is followed by the possessive particle no, which essentially functions like of in this instance, and relates it to the second Chinese loanword yoi, which is a combination of the kanji for make use of and mind, which means something like consideration or preparation. This is followed by another no, except this is the classical Japanese subject marker that simply denotes the part of the sentence that is doing the action. That action being araba, which is a combination of the verb ari, which means to be or to exist, and then conjugated with the hypothetical ba, which turns it into an if-then statement. So the first clause of this poem is something like, if there is consideration to move forces. The second clause begins with the word shinobi, but written in a way that most Japanese readers wouldn't recognize, utilizing two different kanji for steel, the first being an uncommon character, while the latter being more widely understood. Then shinobi is followed by the particle ni, which denotes direction, place, or position, which is itself followed by a second particle wa, which is also used as a subject marker but is a little more definitive than no. The next word is another compound with the first part saki, meaning ahead, in front of, and the word tachite, which comes from the verb tatsu, but is conjugated into a form that allows the sentence to continue. In most circumstances, tatsu means to stand, but considering that it's connected to yuku, which is the verb that means to go, it's used here to express the idea of someone setting out from a place, which is a very common meaning in earlier times. Then we have the third and final Chinese loanword, annai, which is made up of the kanji for idea and the kanji for within, and ultimately means something like guidance, leading the way, or perhaps most aptly in this case, information. Annai is then followed by the particle o, which denotes the object of the sentence or the thing that has the action done to it. And that action being the following mio, which is the command form of the verb miru, which means to see. Thus, this second clause means something to the effect of, have your shinobi go ahead and see the information he brings. Another interesting point is that while the poems are not very long and therefore can't be overly descriptive as a result, they still don't feature a lot of the ambiguity that many artistic poems have, deliberately leaving sentences unfinished or using very vague words to allow for double meaning. But looking at the grammar and details of these poems, they make sure to be very deliberate in communicating their ideas and never leave room for implied meaning by not ending clauses properly. Given the apparent practical nature of these poems and how significant tanka was in Japanese culture at the time, it seems likely that they were meant to be something like ninja nursery rhymes, designed to help those wanting to remember information about utilizing shinobi. The cadence and structure would likely have already been well known to members of the warrior elite, which made it easier to remember the content. One could imagine a shinobi teacher requiring their students to pass off these poems before allowing them access to further knowledge. And just to reiterate, this seemingly deliberate lack of artistry and use of Chinese loanwords suggests that whoever composed these poems was not interested in creating a collection of artistic works that might one day find their way into a prestigious imperial anthology, but rather that these poems were made with the intent to pass on knowledge about shinobi skills and wisdom. The structure and cadence, along with the music, would have been familiar to the samurai who would have been learning these poems. The recitation format of song makes it easier for one to memorize and pass on information. This is most likely why this collection was constructed as it was. So that's going to be it for me. I want to thank everybody for having me on, and if you did enjoy this little poetry breakdown, I do some other poem analyses on my channel, but usually about poems that appear in video games and whatnot. Also, I do translate stories from classical Japanese, specifically from the Heian period, so if you want to hear some of those, please feel free to check it out. So hopefully you found this informative and enjoyable, but I am going to turn it back to the other guys so we can continue talking about cool stuff like ninja and warriors and Sengoku period history and stop talking about poetry. Anyway, thanks so much, guys. See you later.
So far, we've discovered that ninja poems exist. We've looked at the Chinese influence. We've looked at their grammar and their structure. But where did they come from and how were they used? So let's move on to that.
As far as we can tell, these shinobi poems were first recorded in the 17th century military manual, the Gunpo Joshu. The Gunpo Joshu claims that these poems originate in a 12th century document, the Yoshitsune Kakishite Monogatari. However, this is largely dismissed as embellishment. Therefore, the Gunpo Joshu is the earliest known record of these poems. The Gunpo Joshu was published in its finished form in 1653, but the earliest known version dates from the 1610s. There is some disagreement as precisely when, but the most common dates are either 1612 or 1618. There are also those who think there may have been earlier versions, but there is no real evidence of these at this time. The author of the Gunpo Joshu was Ogasawara Tamemasa, whose common name was Katsuzo. He also had the Buddhist name, which he used as his pen name, of Sakun. Besides the Gunpo Joshu, he wrote several other military manuals in his lifetime. It is unclear when he was born, but the most popular date used is 1590. In his youth, he studied Gungaku, military studies, under Ogasawara Sakon Shogen Norimasa. He also studied Chinese classics under Fujiwara Seika, who was a Confucian scholar. There is a theory that Norimasa might have been a Ronin Gungakusha, acting like a guest instructor for lords who would pay him to come and teach Gungaku. Who were the Ogasawara? Very briefly, the Ogasawara are a part of the Seiwa Genji. They were a prominent warrior family in Shinano, modern Nagano Prefecture, dating back to the 12th century. Through the centuries, the main branch were Jito, land stewards, Shugo, military governors, and eventually daimyo in Shinano. There were also numerous branches of the Ogasawara, largely in eastern Japan, but also in central and western Japan. So they came from a long-established warrior family. At some point in the 1610s, the early version of the Gunpo Joshu was written, and it claimed to be a combination of Ogasawara Ryu Gungaku and other material, including earlier material. This included these poems called the Yoshimori Hyakushu, meaning Yoshimori's 100 poems. A hyakushu just being a collection of 100 poems.
We have an idea of where they came from and roughly the time they came about. Probably how they were used. But what we don't know is if they were accompanied by music. So let's have a little bit of a dive into the music behind the poetry.
The history of melody in these military-like poems is one of the biggest mysteries in this entire research project. Much like many of the traditional Japanese arts, we can never know exactly how something was played or sung in its time. A great example of this is the music of the Hitoyogiri, the Sengoku-era shakuhachi. Though we have the manuscripts telling us how things were played, the music bears no indication of dynamics, rhythms, phrasing, or breath marks. We are only left with some interpretive notes, which contradicts one another. The same goes for these Shinobi poems. Before we get into the melody breakdown, it is important that the idea of using music for war or education is not uniquely Japanese. Since ancient times, horns and wind instruments were used to communicate on battlefields, as were drums. Everything from memorizing a code of honor to keeping morale high during long tours. Now onto the music. The idea of these songs is not to have a collection of performance melodies, but rather practical melodies that are easy to remember. In Japanese traditional culture, poems were traditionally sung. This goes back as far as poems found in the Manyoshu, a collection of waka poem from a variety of nobles during the Nara period and earlier. Though each poem itself is beautiful, in order to memorize many of the poems, people would sing them. Many of the ways of singing these poems have been lost. However, there are other traditions of singing music in Japan which have been kept with some accuracy. One is shigin and the other is hikol. Here is a short example of shigin. And here is a short example of hikol.
年の初めに日本と世界のつつがなきを願いて読める君が代は
Shigin, though simpler than a German lieder, it is still filled with many melisma and difficult to sing musical phrases. Here is how Shigin practitioner Justin Bingham, an American who lives in Japan practicing this wonderful art, has to say about it. Shigin is a type of traditional Japanese chanted poetry. The poems span hundreds of years and cover a myriad of topics from war to love and even local legends. The closest thing it could be compared to in Western music would probably be Greek Byzantine chant. The singing is comprised mostly of vibrato and follows a slightly different scale than what people in the West would be familiar with. Shigin was developed around the end of the Edo period by members of the samurai class. At the time, poetry was seen more as something that the upper class did, and many poems that are sung were written by famous Japanese military and political figures such as Nobunaga. Many emperors also composed poems, which eventually would be sung. This would most likely not be the style in which poems were sung. The reason being is that this was an upper class practice, and in addition this was a development off of a previous singing style. However, the following style of hikou falls under the category of simple chanting instead of more melodic chant style which resembles something closer to shomyo. The repetition of simple melody and sustained notes is most likely how the shinobi sung their poems. So what is hikou? From the website hikou.jp, they explain it like this. Hikou of waka refers to the practice of reading a newly composed waka aloud and then adding a melody to it. This kind of oral presentation is believed to have been practiced since the time of the origin of waka. However, during that time it was not called hikou but hikyou. Hikyou is used not only for waka but also for Chinese poetry, kanshi, in the same way. According to a variety of sources, the melodies of the Muromachi period that were notated differ considerably from the ones transmitted today. However, the melodic pattern names have remained the same as well as the general style. So let's take the elements of hikou and place them over the shinobi poems, and let's see how they sound. I hope you enjoy. O kaze ya o ame no furu toki o koso Shinobi o uchi no tayori to wasure.
Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have learnt something about Japanese poetry, and I hope you have learnt something about the ninja. Now, my name's Anthony Cummins, but I'd like to say that Sean has been the leader on this video and he's put everything together. But I'd also like to say a big thank you to Brian and to Scott and to Stephen Najiri, who worked in the background. I'm going to hand you back now to Nick from the Shogunate, who's going to tell you where you can find more information and provide you with links so that you can follow up. So from me and the rest of the team, thank you very much and all the best.
I want to thank Tairyu Shakuhachi, Anthony Cummins, Sengoku Studies, and Tales of Dawn and Dusk for putting together a collaboration on such a fascinating topic. Once again, I highly recommend you go check out their fantastic channels linked down below. And if you want to learn more about the history and writing of the shinobi, I have a playlist for you as well. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.